I am very delighted to have Erik Molvar on today, and he is a wildlife biologist and the executive director of Western Watersheds Project. And one of the things that I so appreciate about Erik is he's so knowledgeable about our public lands and also about the role of wild horses on our public lands. So thank you so much for being on my podcast today, Erik. And if you could start out by telling everyone a little bit about the mission of Western Watersheds Project.
Well, sure. The mission of Western Watersheds Project is to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. And we focus on public lands, federal public lands for the most part. And really, we focus very heavily on land health. And so the health of native ecosystems is the main focus, biodiversity is a main focus, and the impacts of the livestock industry is a primary focus of Western Watersheds Project, which perhaps sets us apart a little bit from some of the other conservation groups.
Right, exactly. And I, of course, want to know about wild horses and our public lands. And as you have said before, wild horses are scapegoated for much of the degradation to our public lands that is done by livestock.
Well, that's right. On Western public lands, when you look at the Bureau of Land Management's own analyses of its land health assessments, the agency itself finds that most of the areas that it surveys are failing its own land health standards. And most of it, the vast majority of that land that's failing is failing because of livestock by the agency's own admission. Of course, a great many hundreds of thousands of acres have never been surveyed for land health at all. And so, land health is a primary focus for our organization and something that we monitor throughout the West. And the wild horses are out there, and like any other species of hoofed animal that forages on grass or other herbaceous material, they can have some effect on the environment, but that effect is proportional to their numbers. And wild horses are outnumbered by cattle in the West by about 32 to 1 on the public lands. And if you consider all lands together, the number goes north of 240 to 1 in terms of how badly they're outnumbered by cattle. And so the vast majority of the ecological impact to ecosystems and where ecosystems are degraded, that blame lays squarely at the feet of the livestock industry and the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service land managers who don't do enough to rein that in, and not on wild horses, which these agencies like to point the finger of blame at in order to distract everyone away from the damages that's being done by cattle and sheep.
And I was looking too at your wonderful map of the domestic livestock grazing on wild horse herd management areas on the website. And I'm definitely going to put a link to that on my website with where the podcast goes, because it's very interesting to look at the herd management areas, see wild horse numbers versus the livestock grazing numbers.
Well, that's right. And almost everywhere you look, this isn't always the case, but almost everywhere you look, the number of animal unit months, which is the measure of livestock grazing intensity and wild horse grazing intensity, when you compare the two with that map, you'll find that typically livestock AUMs outnumber wild horse AUMs by 2 to 1, 3 to 1, sometimes even 10 to 1 in different herd management areas that have been set aside for the protection of wild horses. And that's kind of ironic because wild horses are, protected by law, by the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, whereas cattle are allowed to rent public land for private livestock grazing. But it's a privilege, it's not a right, and it's optional on the part of the agencies. And according to the Code of Federal Regulations, on these wild horse herd management areas, the agencies can close those areas to all or a particular kind of livestock, either temporarily or permanently, and are allowed to do that in order to protect the land health. But we never see the agency actually exercise that authority and make that particular choice because the agency does tend to put its thumb on the scale in favor of the livestock to the detriment of the wild horses, but also to the detriment of the deer and the elk and the pronghorns and every other native species that is utilizing that vegetation base.
Yes, anecdotally, I have been out in Adobe Town and watched them put sheep out in April when the grass is barely starting to grow. And then they take the sheep away and then they put the cattle out in the same area. And it's amazing that there's any grass left at all. It just doesn't make any sense to me how they're grazing as well.
And each of these grazing leases that the BLM or the Forest Service is in charge of administering, they'll authorize up to 65% forage utilization. And that is all the grass and other palatable forage that grows between January 1st of one year and December 31st of that year. 65% can go into a cow or a sheep, which leaves 35%, if that's the level, of grass and other forage for things like elk, for things like deer, for things like jackrabbits and mice and wild horses too, of course. And so basically the wild species that are out there on public lands, those species that the public is most interested, quite frankly, are the ones that are getting the leftovers when the cattle are done taking the lion's share.
Yes, nobody goes to Wyoming to go visit the cattle. That's just not happening, or the sheep. So, something else that someone had raised to me recently, which I find really interesting and has got to be true, is that cattle are bigger now than they used to be. And it doesn't seem like that's being taken into account with the AUMs.
No, it's really not. And when the animal unit month was first concocted as the measure of forage utilization, the average cow was 1,000 pounds. And that's a big animal. But today, the average cow, when it goes to slaughter, is over 1,400 pounds. So that's a 40% increase in weight. And some of that is due to breeding and selective breeding for larger cattle. And some of that is due to the switching of different breeds of cattle. So it used to be back in the 1960s, it was all Herefords on the Western ranges. Today, you hardly ever see a Hereford because they're smaller and they're rangier. And now you see a lot of Red Angus and Black Angus and Charolais, which are larger breeds of cattle. And so, as the cattle industry has scaled up the individual cow, the amount of forage that individual cow has to eat to sustain itself also scales up proportionately. But the agency has not adjusted how many animal unit months a cow accounts for versus all these other species accordingly, because the wild horses are about the same size as they were in 1960. The elk are about the same size. The mule deer are about the same size, and the pronghorn are about the same size. But it's only the cows that are growing ever bigger and bigger, and yet their numbers aren't being decreased proportionately to the amount of weight gain that they've had over this multi-decade span.
Yes, yeah. And the lawsuit that Western Watersheds Project is part of, as well as American Wild Horse Campaign, Animal Welfare Institute, Kimberly Curl, me, and Chad Hansen is on. We're trying to stop the zeroing out of herds in the Rock Springs area, Saltwells Creek, Great Divide Basin, cutting Adobe Town in half, and then managing White Mountain, I think, as pretty much a sterile herd. This is really taking away land that belongs rightfully to the horses.
Well, and this has been going on for decades. And if you look at the original herd areas that were designated under the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act in the Red Desert, they have already shrunk the herd management areas that exist today about a third from what they used to be. And there are a lot of areas that contain wild horses that are out on the public lands, but they happen to be outside these artificial boundaries that the Bureau of Land Management has shrunk down for these wild horses as the area where they're going to be managing them. And this makes no sense at all because there aren't any kinds of barriers to wild horses at the edges of these herd management areas. It's not like they correspond to highways that have fences and are impassable, or even have allotment management fences dividing them. They're just open range, and the horses go where the horses always went. And yet, horses that are inside the herd management area may be treated a lot differently by the agency than horses that wander outside into lands that were originally designated for them. And of course, now today, we've got this new plan amendment that is currently being challenged, as you noted, in court, that wants to zero out several of the herd management areas, that wants to zero out salt wells, that wants to zero out Great Divide, even though those areas were meeting the thriving natural ecological balance that is required under the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. And one of the things that I think this lawsuit puts a very fine point on is, is the agency supposed to be setting these appropriate management levels toward reaching a thriving natural ecological balance or not? And the law says that that's what they're supposed to be doing. And yet the agency has reset the appropriate management level to zero for several of these herds, despite the fact that even before the 2020 roundups began, when the herds in this Rock Springs field office numbered more than 5,000 animals, those herds were inhabiting habitats that were meeting the thriving natural ecological balance by the Bureau of Land Management's own analysis. So the agency has admitted for itself that it didn't have an ecological problem in the Red Desert and the neighboring Rock Springs areas where they had wild horses. They just wanted to zero them out. And the dirty little secret about what's going on in the Rock Springs field office is that the Rock Springs Grazing Association, which is a cattlemen's organization, has been trying to zero out wild horses so that they can have the forage for their own cattle and sheep, and not have the competition from this species of wild herbivore. And back in the early part of the Obama administration, they approached the administration and said, "We want you to get rid of the horses on our checkerboard squares, because the Rock Springs Grazing Association has either ownership or leases on private checkerboard that surrounds the railroad 20 miles either side of the tracks. And the wild horses go freely between the public squares and the private squares." And the Rock Springs Grazing Association basically approached the Obama administration and said, well, we want you to get rid of them. And the Obama administration told them, well, we can't do that. But if you sue us, then we'll sign a settlement with you. And the result of that was a 2013 consent decree under which the Bureau of Land Management signed, and this is, a legally binding document that said that they would consider a plan amendment that would zero out several of these herds, that would reduce other herds in the Red Desert area and the Checkerboard. And in fact, the plan amendment that they finalized in 2020 not only considered these things, but actually implemented them and approved them formally. And Western Watersheds Project believes, and I think our co-plaintiffs believe as well, that these plan amendments are in fact illegal, do violate the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, and certainly don't represent a rational multiple use decision by an agency that's supposed to be upholding the public interest.
And the checkerboard is so contentious. The BLM is basically saying horses may stray onto private lands, so we want to get rid of them. And of course, the checkerboard situation is a nightmare and allows the Grazing Association to really lock up control of the area. And I really see that we need to have land swaps. And I originally was thinking, oh, we have to have the cooperation of the private owners, but we really don't, do we?
Well, actually, the federal government has the power of eminent domain, where it can basically condemn or take ownership of any private land that is in the public interest and advances a public goal. Now, of course, the federal agencies are very reluctant to use the power of eminent domain. They generally use it quite a bit when it comes to approving pipeline and highway rights of way and transmission lines and those sorts of things. But they don't do it very often or very effectively when it comes to land management. But in this case, you've got this absurd land management, or land ownership pattern around the railroads where, back in the day of Abraham Lincoln, it was deemed a good idea to deed over half of the land on 20 miles on either side of the railroad tracks and give it to the railroad as an incentive for building these big transcontinental lines that were going to tie the country together. They're going to be so important for our economy and our defense for this frontier European colonial power that was emerging on the North American continent that came to be known as the United States. And so, in doing this in that pattern, they inadvertently created this land management nightmare in which you have vast stretches of unfenced area, undifferentiated on the ground, some of which is private, some of which is public, for which people in some areas who want to go out and visit the public lands, camp on the public lands, hike on the public lands, hunt on the public lands, are harassed by the intervening private landowners, who are then able to set up trespassing situations. And there is, in fact, a case going on in federal court right now around elk hunting in an area called Elk Mountain, which is farther east along the Checkerboard, in which a private rancher bought up all the private checkerboard squares and then declared that nobody could come and visit or hunt and fish and camp and hike on those lands. And some hunters from, I believe it was Nebraska, came out to hunt elk. They brought with them ladders that they could climb over the corners without actually setting foot on any of the private lands. They used their GPSs to determine exactly where the corners were. And they went elk hunting. And they went elk hunting with an eye toward, maybe testing the idea that the private landowner could stop them. And of course, they were arrested for trespassing, and then the landowners sued them, and now this is going into the federal court system. And I think at the center of this case is the Unlawful Enclosures Act, in which private landowners cannot restrict access to public lands. And the ironic piece of it is that this was originally set up in the 1800s by Congress to protect access to forage and grazing by cattlemen who were having cattle drives and wanted to be able to go and forage their cattle for free on the public domain. So, things have come full circle, and now the cattlemen want to defend private property rights and no longer want to be on the side of public land access.
Right. Well, and it seems like if there could be a consolidation of public lands in these checkerboard areas, it would be beneficial to the wild horses. But one thing that I have observed in Saltwells Creek, Great Divide Basin, is that the horses migrate seasonally. They are not in the same areas in the spring as they are in the winter, and to cut an HMA in half would be difficult for the wildlife. Is that something that you have observed?
Well, certainly you want to have as large an area as possible when you have large and potentially migratory wildlife populations that are using an area. And in the Red Desert of Wyoming, one of the big examples is the pronghorn herd. And when the interstate was put through the middle of the Red Desert in the late 1960s, and a fence was built alongside it to keep the antelope off the highway, they effectively cut the Red Desert habitats in half. And all of the summer ranges for pronghorn are north of the interstate. And all of the best winter ranges are south of the interstate. And in exceptionally hard winters, like the winter we saw in 2022, 2023, those antelope would go drain clear out of Wyoming down into Colorado and find severe winter relief habitat, is what it's called, down in Colorado, where they could survive. And by slicing and dicing up that pronghorn habitat in that way, when we did have that last really big hard winter a year ago, then the pronghorn population was just decimated to the north of the interstate because it was unable to get across the interstate and get down to the winter ranges. That illustrates the kinds of problems that you can have when you start dicing up the big areas of habitat needed by migratory herbivores, and kind of creating impediments to migration or restrictions to the lands that they can access.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, last winter was horrendous. And especially in the Red Desert Complex and in Adobe Town, I have observed so many horse deaths and other animals as well. And so, yes, the bigger the area, the less impediment for grazing and moving around obviously makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, I still think that consolidating the checkerboard would be a big benefit. And
It would be huge, and that's something that I have advocated, while working with Western Watersheds Project, but also before I was working for WWP, I advocated for that with Wild Earth Guardians, as a means to try and create some, kind of better land management. And the idea would be to consolidate the private lands in one area and the public lands in another area. And the right way to do this, in my view, would be to kind of look at the sensitive resources that are out there, the resources that are valuable to the public. Those lands would tend to go towards public land ownership and under federal ownership. So the sage grouse priority habitats, the potential wilderness in the haystacks, the mule deer migration corridor that comes down from the Hoback area up in northwestern Wyoming, are great areas that could go into public ownership. There are parts of the Continental Divide Wamsutter gas field, and there's another unit called the Monell unit that's an old oil field, that are heavily industrialized, maybe very commercially valuable, but for the public, they're useless because they've been trashed from an ecological standpoint, from a recreational standpoint. These are industrial landscapes. Let those go into private ownership so that the private landowners can then make money from them, and let the public have those lands that are still relatively pristine. And the wild horses would benefit from that as well. I think it was back in about 2014 or so, and I was working for Wild Earth Guardians, and the Rock Springs Grazing Association at that time was trying to advocate for getting rid of the wild horses. And I said, well, gee, why don't we have a trade here where we have, the Rock Springs Grazing Association, we can do this land swap. All the private lands could then be kept free from wild horses, so they wouldn't have any competition from their cattle. And there could be no cattle on the public lands of the Red Desert, and there could be more forage for wild horses and every other herbivore. And it would be, everybody would not only have an equitable situation, but a better situation than they have now.
And then, would you say removing cattle and sheep from wild horse HMAs would be the most beneficial?
Certainly, removing the cattle and sheep from these land areas and taking off that grazing pressure, which can approach 2/3 of the forage that's produced every year, would not only benefit wild horses, it would benefit every other species of wildlife. It would benefit the vegetation itself. Cattle evolved in the boggy forests of northern Europe, so they concentrate along waterways and at springs. And those are the areas that are ecologically most critical for the largest number of different species of wildlife as well. And horses and bison are different. They graze over vast areas. Wild horses can forage 10, 20 miles away from water, and then spread their impacts across a much bigger area of land instead of just concentrating in those wetter, most productive, most ecologically important areas. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for any place that has a kind of release from livestock grazing pressure shows an amazing rebound. We have some areas where there have been livestock grazing permit buyouts. There are national parks that don't allow livestock grazing. And when you cross that national park boundary, you can see right along the fence line this amazing difference, lush vegetation inside the park, grazed down to a very, short putting green outside the fence. And it's that ecological pressure has a huge consequence, not just for forage production, but also for the kinds of grasses and vegetation species that can survive there. Because if you have heavy grazing by livestock, particularly by sheep and cattle, what ends up happening is that the grazing intolerant grasses that are the long-term perennial bunch grasses that can live for 10 or 20, 30, even more years as an individual plant get hammered and hammered and hammered year in, year out until they finally die. And when they die, they're not replaced by more bunch grasses. They're often replaced by the invasive weed cheatgrass, which is an annual weed
And
that came in
flammable.
from Eurasia.
Yeah, and very
And
flammable.
it comes in and it takes over.
Yeah.
And it is such a prolific seed producer that, and also it gets a head start in its growth. It starts growing at least 2 weeks before the native bunchgrass seedlings do. So seedling to seedling, it has us in the arms race to monopolize the soil nutrients and the soil water. That cheatgrass is armed with an advantage, and it will strangle out the seedlings of the native bunchgrasses when you have both of those seed banks competing with each other. And so once you graze away the perennial bunch grasses, which by the way can outcompete a cheatgrass seedling and keep the cheatgrass out, once those are grazed away and the cheatgrass moves in, then you have a kind of a death spiral of cheatgrass monoculture. And once that gets established, pretty soon, cheatgrass lives for about 6 weeks in the spring when it's green. And that's the period of the year when herbivores will eat it, both domestic and wild. And then after that time, it dries out. It's dead. It has these cheats or these achines that are very sharp and pointy and get into the mouths of herbivores, and nothing wants to eat it. And it has very low nutritional value. So here you have in the late part of the summer, the early part of the fall, you have all this standing dead fine fuel that's just waiting for a spark. And when it gets a spark, whether that's a carelessly thrown cigarette butt, or it's a spark from somebody's ATV, or it's a lightning strike, or whatever it happens to be, that cheatgrass lights right up and that fire can spread throughout. And if you have cheatgrass underneath sagebrush, well, the cheatgrass can burn and be fine next year because it will survive as seed and sprout again the following year. But sagebrush is fire intolerant and it is killed, and it will not sprout from the rootstock once it's burned. And so you can wipe out the sagebrush for long periods of time. And that's what we're seeing in places like northern Nevada, where we've had heavy livestock grazing, big invasions of cheatgrass into the understory, then the fires, then the cheatgrass monoculture. Now you've got habitat for pronghorn antelope, for sage grouse, for pygmy rabbits, and all the other sagebrush dependent species that has been completely wiped out and replaced by an invasive species that has no habitat value for the wildlife.
And then, of course, we have climate change. So that's even more alarming in these dry, high desert areas.
And climate change, it's a very interesting what the cheatgrass science says about climate change, because the droughts that we're getting more and more, cheatgrass is less numerous during the droughts, but what ends up happening is that the droughts kill off the native bunch grasses, whereas the cheatgrass can survive it as seeds.
Mm.
And so when the drought is over and the rains come, then the cheatgrass come back full force, and the native bunch grasses really struggle. And so that's every time there's a drought, it ratchets a little bit more into the cheatgrass's favor, and the cheatgrass spreads. And the other thing that happens with climate change is we have warming temperatures. And cheatgrass does better in hotter, drier, more arid climates. So in Wyoming and Northwest Colorado, we have high elevations and long winters. There's not as much cheatgrass as you see in places like southwestern Colorado or New Mexico or the Great Basin. But the cheatgrass is coming. And as the climate warms, it's getting more and more suitable for cheatgrass. And so we are on the cusp of having really major invasions. And if you look at the Powder Rim, which is right on the southern edge of the Red Desert on the Colorado border, there's some areas that burned in the 2000s that have been heavily invaded by cheatgrass. That's the future of the Red Desert if we don't get a handle on the livestock grazing intensity on these public land grazing leases.
So, what do you see as going to be helpful moving forward? I mean, it's really easy seeing what's facing wild horses and just despairing, and also seeing what's facing our public lands. So, what do you see moving forward as as the most helpful things for people to concentrate on?
Well, certainly these big planning documents like the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan Amendment or revision, I'm sorry, are really important because the protections and management provisions that get into these long-term land use plans are there for 20 years. And they create new rules of the road that can then be used to help out conservation, no matter what the species is that you want to focus on. So for the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan, if you're a wild horse advocate, this is the place where the appropriate management levels can be reset by the agency if it so chooses. And certainly before the 2020 roundups, we had 5,000 wild horses in the Rock Springs planning area, or more than that, and a thriving natural ecological balance. So it would be logical to say, well, let's set the appropriate management level in order to achieve that thriving natural ecological balance. And we know what the floor is for that number, and that's 5,000 animals.
Right.
So it would be logical to do that. And it would be logical to say, hey, why don't we have herd management areas, boundaries that are expanded to encompass the areas that the wild horses are actually occurring in anyway? It's a distinction without a difference to have smaller herd management areas if the wild horses are actually using larger areas anyway. It makes more sense to take stock of what is actually happening out on the land and manage accordingly.
Of
In
course,
my
the
view.
BLM never expands herd management areas.
Well, it hasn't in the past, right? But that doesn't mean that there's any rule that prevents them from
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah, that's true. So, in the commenting on the RMPs, really, it seems like lawsuits are the only thing that really makes the BLM listen or change things, at least in my experience.
Well, I've been working on the Bureau of Land Management issues for 23 years myself, and it does seem true that the agency only seems to listen to industry lobbyists and lawsuits. And when you can get a judge to tell the agency that it's breaking its own laws or its own regulations, and it needs to do something to change, that's what they're often waiting for. And in fact, at Western Watersheds Project, we were once told by a Bureau of Land Management field manager that, hey, I'm not going to change these livestock grazing numbers and regulations. I go to the same grocery stores as these ranchers. My kids go to the same schools.
Yeah.
I don't want to take the heat. I'm waiting for you guys to sue me, and then we can change the grazing regime.
Yes,
And
Rock
and,
Springs is a
and
very special town.
and I mean, if it doesn't, if that's the philosophy of these bureaucracies, and it does seem to be that way, and
Right.
that's reality, then it takes organizations like Western Watersheds Project, like American Wild Horse Campaign, like the Animal Wellness Institute, and or our other co-plaintiff, that to challenge the agency and hold it accountable,
Yeah,
and make sure that they're following their own laws, because the sad thing is that they can't be trusted to do that in the absence of pressure from the courts.
exactly. Or in absence of some sort of change in leadership with the BLM. It just seems like uh, even though we have a new Secretary of the Interior, we're just powering on doing the same old things and nothing really has changed.
In my conversations in Washington with senior, agency officials, both in this administration and the last, they like to point out that the Bureau of Land Management is very decentralized, that there's not a lot of kind of hierarchical control from above, and that a lot of the power is vested within the individual state directors. And so then it becomes really important, who these state directors are. And, the way that you rise in federal land management agencies and the way that you get promoted is by going along to get along, not making waves, kind of making sure all of the politically influential local economic interests are appeased at all turns. And so it's almost like, just like the cattleman breeds his livestock for tractability and size and weight gain. The agencies sort of breed their employees for tractability and kind of going along to get along
Yeah,
and
yeah.
promoting the kinds of extractive industries that are so powerful and that are making money from the public land while ignoring the vast majority of the general public and its interests in recreation and abundant wild species on public lands and scenic vistas and the kinds of things that the public gets a benefit out of.
So lawsuits, definitely. Getting educated about the issue for sure. Anything else you can suggest for people who are just concerned and want to help the wild horses?
Well, champions in Congress on any issue become really important because congressional representatives who get a bee under their bonnet and start putting pressure on the agencies for good or for ill, because some of them, are anti-environmental and exert a lot of influence. That can make a big difference. And in my numerous meetings in DC with congressional offices, it's always emphasized to me that if a couple dozen phone calls or emails come in a certain week on a particular topic, that topic gets the attention of that senator or that representative and gets talked about in the staff meetings and gets elevated as something to address. So, that's the thing about a representative democracy is it can work for people too. It's not just big corporations that can, have big campaign contributions and things like that. That there's a role for the public as well if you can get a large enough number of people. And indeed, the biggest successes of the wild horse advocacy universe have been the Wild Horse Annie Act and the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, that happened because there were big outpourings of public support directed at Congress, and then Congress acting in the interests of that broad swath of the public that had spoken out.
Okay. Yes, that sounds good. Um, let's see, what else? What else in Wyoming do you think is important to know?
Well, certainly, the Red Desert isn't the only place with wild horses. There are wild horses in the Wind River Basin and the Bighorn Basin. There aren't wild horses out on the plains anymore, which is interesting because, during the time of an indigenous people, there were 2 to 7 million wild horses that were roaming North America as of the era of Lewis and Clark, and they were everywhere. They were everywhere you can imagine, and that's interesting to me because at that time, that was also the time of the greatest biodiversity that any white person has ever seen in Wyoming. Now, who knows what it might have looked like, 20,000 years ago? There would have been steppe bison, perhaps, or other species. But I mean, the wild horses were here when the first white explorers got here already because they had become established, and the wild horses also evolved in North America. And the very Rock Springs field offices areas that we're talking about wild horse management today, these are the places with the earliest wild horses. The Eohippus or Hyracotherium, which was the dawn horse, their skeletons can still be found in the Washakie Formation, the ash beds from those ancient eruptions of the Yellowstone caldera. And I've actually been out to some of these areas in the southern Red Desert and found the little ends of the cannon bones, as horse people would know them, the fused metacarpals and fused metatarsals of their lower legs, and those fossils are out there, and throughout the history of North America, horses evolved together with the vegetation communities that came in succession during the ice ages and since. Um, and they were here all
They have
the
their
way up
niche. They have
700
their
years.
ecological niche. They belong.
Well, there's certainly room for them here, and the species that we have today of vegetation evolved alongside wild horses at some point.
Yes.
So, so they're, I mean, when people say, "Oh, they're a non-native invasive species," that doesn't account for 53 million years of evolution
Right. Right.
that happened here in North America.
Well, I really appreciate all of your knowledge and insight, and I also really appreciate how supportive you have always been and Western Watersheds Project of wild horses. And I really appreciate your coming on today and talking about this and letting people know.
Well, thanks, Carol. And I mean, we're not supportive of wild horses because we're wild horse advocates. We're not. We're supportive of wild horses because we don't want to see wild horses blamed for the ecological damage that's done by cattle and sheep, because that prevents the problem from getting fixed. And that's exactly why the ranchers and the Bureau of Land Management engage in that kind of misinformation. It's because they don't want people to see that the real problem is being caused by cattle and sheep and the Bureau of Land Management's mismanagement of cattle and sheep. And quite frankly, there's this big myth that goes around that says, oh, well, the cattle and sheep are managed out there. Are you kidding me? Most of the ranchers use what we call the Columbus method, where they turn their cattle out on the pasture in the spring and then try to discover them in the fall. There's no management involved. Those cattle are just turned out and forgotten about for 6 months.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all the work that you do on behalf of public lands and the species that inhabit them. And I know you spend a lot of time out there and in all sometimes adverse conditions, because I remember once I was out there at one of these gathers for the Great Divide and it was 7 degrees and you were out there.
It's true. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thanks again. And I'm delighted to be made available, and I'm happy to speak to you anytime.